right, everybody. So today on the podcast, we have a roundtable with Abel Csabai and Brandon DaCruz. How you guys doing?
Not too bad.
Doing well, man. Good to be back on with you guys. It's been a really long time, it feels
I
like.
guess it has been. I always lose track because honestly, like we'll talk when I talk to people in like DMs and everything, and like you're following people along, you kind of lose track of like when the last time you actually spoke live with somebody is. But yeah, I guess it probably has been whenever the first bulk and cut roundtable we did was. So
Yeah.
so
I'm saying that had to be around May because I know the summer hadn't started yet. So I think the summer has flown by already. We're already in September. It's crazy to think about.
It is crazy, yeah. So we were chatting a little bit before recording. I said, let's pause there because it's a topic I actually wanted to get into. So, we were talking about some people who are just truly genetic freaks. And I think the topic's always going to be interesting to people because I think for the people who aren't the genetic freaks, they want to believe that that person's either doing something that they can do. Maybe it's a routine, maybe it's some sort of like diet. They also want to tend to say that these people are lying and are using, gear or something. And obviously that can be true, right? I think there's obviously plenty of people who are, quote unquote, fake natties out there. But I also really marvel at the people who are just like truly outliers. There was a kid in my high school this guy, Kenny Impanza, and he was on the wrestling team, probably 5'9", like lean 190, 195. But just like the freak of the school, like super, super strong. Like I remember this girl commenting that like she couldn't even hug him because it was just like she couldn't get her arms around him. And we had like maybe like him and one other guy. And like you just think that, okay, this guy was 17 and he took gear and then kept going with it for like another 10 years. These people exist and it's really fascinating to see them.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't even know which part of that I should comment on. But so, yeah, it's interesting because I used to be one of those people when I saw someone with a really impressive or like really freaky physique. My first question to them online would be, how long have you been training? Mm-hmm. And obviously the implicit question behind that was, how long will it take for me to look like you, which is kind of the wrong question to ask. But I don't know, man, like I've always had a stance on this that I don't even share publicly anymore because I'm just getting a ton of shit for it anytime I do it. And I just get pissed off when I'm reading those comments. But I can really believe a lot of these guys that are really adamant on YouTube that they are natural. Because what I tend to see is that those that aren't, they just kind of not talk about it. Or maybe they will mention it here and there, but they're not going to go to great lengths at like convincing someone that they're natural. So, for example, Med Does Fitness, he recently had a talk with More Plates, More Dates. And I don't know, like I could really believe that he could be natural. Like, of course, we will never know for sure, but I'm just confused when I'm reading all the comments under videos like that like, oh my God, this guy is lying. Like he's a psychopath. Like how can he be so deceptive and whatever? And it's like, man, like imagine if you're wrong. Like you're just accusing a person who might just be a really freaky genetics guy and he is not lying. He's just enjoying that he has great genetics and he's making really good gains. And yeah, like we talked about, we all saw the pictures of Jared Federer. After 6 months of lifting, he had a better physique than many people will ever have. I would say he has a better physique than I have now. And I moved heaven and earth to get to where I'm at. And, like a lot of people would look at his peaked natural physique and say that there is no way that was natty. But look at him now. Basically, he looks like he was when he was natural. It's just like an extra, 50 pounds or something like that. So I don't know. I rambled a little bit. Sorry for that.
I think I agree with you, Abel. I also, when I see people make these type of comments and stuff, first and foremost, it's like they're doing no harm, especially if it's someone that they're out on the internet, they're just sharing some of their personal journey. It's like if they want to claim natural or they're not, it's their personal business. Now, if they're selling a product or selling a program, that's where I see people have more of an issue of the natty or not type of discussion. And that's where I do understand where people are coming from and taking offense or really going at these individuals. But if those people, these specific individuals, say like a Doug Miller, like we spoke about off air, I know Doug personally, and he's been adamant that he is natural. And there are people that they go on a natty witch hunt on this guy due to the fact that, he has a very, very impressive physique. And he honestly, I coach a lot of NPC level competitors as well as IFBB. He could easily be an IFBB pro, especially for the fact that he's in his 40s now. So he'd be competing in a master's division. But people take such offense to it. And it's like, Doug has never put out anything out there that would hurt someone by following. He preaches high intensity training. He preaches, consistent nutrition. He owns a supplement company that is third party verified. Like, it's not like he's selling a bunch of bullshit. He's living his life. If you look at pictures of him 20 years ago in his early 20s when he first started getting into bodybuilding, he had a really good structure, really good physique. It's like this guy's made solid progression throughout the years, but it's nothing astronomical where you would think, oh, he put on 10 pounds of stage weight in 1 year where it had to be anabolics. So it's like, I think it really has to come back to the point where we really analyze what is this person putting out into the internet or into the space. Are they contributing positively or negatively? And if they're contributing some negative information and then tying that to being natural and trying to sell people on an ideology, whether it be training, nutrition, or supplementation wise, that's where there's more room for criticism and stuff of that sort. But if not, people have to let this stuff go. We're all entitled to our own personal lives, just like we don't share maybe medical information about ourselves. Maybe people don't want to share their hormonal status. I know a lot of guys that are on testosterone replacement that don't share it because they think that it would essentially impede their progression, their career, because people will attribute everything that they've gotten up to that point to testosterone replacement, when in actuality, they didn't get on this until they were very highly progressed in their training career, and they haven't made that much progress. Because if we really look at, I don't know if you guys have ever looked at like James Krieger, he's done research on, testosterone values. If you're in a physiological range, for every 100 to 200 milligrams of testosterone that you increase, so say you go from 400 to 600 nanograms per deciliter, we're seeing about a 1 kilogram increase in lean body mass. Yes, that's 2.2 pounds, but it's nothing that's going to dramatically transform your physique. If you had a shit physique and you put on 2.2 pounds because you went into like the higher end of the natural range, it's really not going to make or break things. It's not going to turn you into a freak. And I think we see that with a lot of individuals where we see their natural foundation, like someone like a Lee Priest, who at 17 had a freak physique, or we were speaking about Nsima Yin Yang, or he was a genetic specimen. Even if you look at his pictures at 15, or even if you look at his most recent competition pictures where he's in his early 20s, they had this solid foundation. So even if they were to layer on, anabolics on top of that, it's already off of a good foundation. They've already put in the base. It's not like the same thing as a kid that at 17 starts taking gear, and every single result that they've had, that we see is based off their usage of anabolics.
Yeah, I think the TRT thing, I get it too, because like you said, it's like one of those things where it's like, to the average person, if you say steroids or testosterone, it's almost like heroin in their mind. It's like you can't be associated with this thing. It's just like, it's such a bad thing to talk about, which is changing. Definitely that is changing. People are becoming, more accepting of it. I think with the TRT, that's also so individual. Like I had a guy, Matt Terry on, and he and one other person, Cornelius Parkin, were saying that in their personal experience, now these are like hyper responders, they said that they are able to hold another like 20 pounds of muscle on TRT than off TRT. I would say that is on the extreme end, because I have clients who are on TRT who literally, frankly, like look like they've just started lifting. And I have clients who have like maybe gained a little bit. I also, where you come from is going to depend, right? So if you had 400 nanograms per deciliter testosterone, and for some reason you wanted to go on TRT and you only went up to 700, then yeah, you might get that 6.6 pounds, 3 kilograms. But then you also have to consider with TRT, in theory, one of the big benefits of it is that you don't have these fluctuating levels all the time. You're just kind of stable across. So whatever, maybe it's 8 pounds, but I'm not saying that that's not going to make a difference to your physique. Obviously it will. I'm just saying that, like, if you see somebody who is really impressive, that's not just because of that. And that, we can go down a whole rabbit hole with that. But the point is like, I agree with you that I think the longer that you've been lifting while talking and knowing a lot of other lifters, the more you kind of drop the skepticism, I think, where you just see some of these freaks out there. Like I've mentioned before, I have a buddy, Josh, who out of our friend group is probably the most genetically gifted, but he's not a freak of freaks. He's just within our college group. He's the most gifted. You know, he was a good athlete. You know, he's going to go to college on a baseball scholarship, and he will literally hold like 20 pounds more muscle than any of us easily, like without really even thinking about it. And so, like, imagine if this guy, you know, took it to the next level, really cared as much as say like we did. And then imagine somebody with even better genetics. I mean, you can just see how with a sport or activity where you have millions of people doing it, you're going to get some total freaks.
No, absolutely. Yeah. You know, the issue with this though, with fitness is that we don't look at it in an objective fashion like we do with basketball or other sports. A lot of people, they look at fitness and they think, or they see an influencer or a professional athlete or a professional bodybuilder, and they say, well, if I work hard enough, I can get there. And that's just not realistic, because when I watch the NFL or the NBA, I realize that I played sports my entire life and I was a decent athlete, but I know that there's skills that I'm never going to be able to emulate. And I'm fine with that. You know, just like height is very inheritable, so is muscle mass. And so a lot of times people have this issue, or they have this inability to, you know, separate themselves, their personal opinions and their feelings from the fact that we all have different genetics. We all have, you know, in terms of, say, TRT, like you were talking about Cornelius, these are guys that are hyper responders. What we really see in the TRT literature is that it's based on not only your androgen receptor density, but your CAG repeats. So the more CAG repeats you have, the less sensitive your androgen receptors tend to be. So when they've tested people in this, when people have, I think the spectrum's between 8 and 35, when you have, you know, the normal within that range is 8 to 24 CAG repeats. But if you had 8, you're much more sensitive. So someone, you know, whether it's natural or not, you know, if they're at 800 nanograms per deciliter with 8 CAG repeats, they're going to be much more sensitive to that level of circulating serum testosterone, as compared to someone, if they're on the opposite end of the spectrum, they have 35, they have the same testosterone level, and that would be within the optimal range for a natural physiological level, but they're less responsive. So they're not getting that same type of response to the same amount of testosterone. So it is highly genetic. And even when it comes down to using exogenous hormones, just because you have a great natural base, if you have a ton of CAG repeats, you might not be a hyper responder to testosterone. I've seen guys, and I've worked with people that have great natural foundations, and they go on testosterone replacement, or even they use a cycle, and they don't respond in the same way that everyone expected. People look at them and they say, well, they're optimizing their training, their nutrition. They have a ton of muscle, and they go on 500 milligrams of testosterone, and we don't see that same response that we see in the Bayesian study, where people are making gains like sitting on their couch. You know what I mean? And a lot of people will always point to that, and it's like that. Science is reporting the averages, but if you actually look at the scatter plot, you'll see that there's some people at the end of the spectrum that gained hardly nothing, and there's guys that gained, you know, astronomically more than what was reported in that study. And then we're taking the mean average of all of that.
Sure. I have one other thing I want to add, unless you had something, Abel.
No, just a random thought that not so random, but like we talked about this just kind of privately, is I always find it just kind of weird why there's this witch hunt going on in the first place, because the general reasoning is that they're giving people unrealistic expectations. And I would say that that's true if they are framing things that way. So if the message behind any kind of educational post that they make or something is that this is how I got here by doing these things, then yes, that's giving them unrealistic expectations. And that's kind of just deceiving in general, because that's just not reality. And either you're ignorant and you're not acknowledging even for yourself, like what led to your success, or you're intentionally deceiving people or misleading people. But I would say that the same thing applies to someone with really, really good genetics. So if let's take Steve Hall, for example, who creates really good content. He's natural. He has really good genetics. I think now we can realize it now that he has milked out his potential pretty well. Is he unethical because he's not disclosing under every post that, like, by the way, all that I said in this post, that all applies, but just so you know, you will probably not look like me. I mean, so most of my clients do what I tell them to do, but most of them don't look like me because I have really good genetics. So, like, I think basically, like, whether it's gear or whether it's genetics, as far as you're concerned, it doesn't really matter, because you should have the same outlook on it. It's like, whatever it is, I probably cannot get there if I don't have one of those things myself, or just kind of put it in the right perspective, in that, like, it's still good content. And even if I cannot get there myself, it still doesn't mean that it's not going to work well, and I shouldn't listen to that person. So just what I wanted to say.
When I was on somebody else's podcast, we got into a discussion and asking if I could take all the steroids I wanted, but no side effects. So I'm just getting the muscular potential of the steroids, or I could be natural, but give myself elite level genetics. So in terms of muscle size, structure, whatever, I said, not even close, I would take the genetics. Because
it's cheaper too.
Yeah, even if cost wasn't a thing, it would just, like, it's not even close, because frankly, when we see the crazy genetic responses, or the crazy responses to steroids, those are still, as you pointed out with, like, the scatter plots, Brandon, those are still the genetic freaks. Some people, if you have average, just totally average genetics, your response to steroids are probably going to be pretty mediocre, and you'll gain muscle. Don't get me wrong, they will do a lot for you, but there are people who just don't respond that well. And so by far, genetics are going to be a bigger factor there. And especially once you factor in muscle shape and insertion. I think I asked Abel yesterday, because he's asked me before, like, height and measurements. And I asked him the length from his knee down to his foot. And I then measured mine. Now, Abel and I are the same height. And just that one thing, I had like 2.5 inches longer. So you're talking like just the bottom of your leg. And that's how our calves could measure similarly. Maybe his is like a 1/2 inch bigger, but most people would say he has great calves and I have horrible calves. And you're talking a 1/2 inch difference, but that just goes to insertions and shape. And that's one small factor when you get into genetics, right? So there's so much that would go into it. I would say genetics reign supreme by a long shot.
No, I agree completely. And the big thing about genetics, it's not only about what genetics you have, but it's also your perception about your genetics. So I often find myself speaking with clients about their psychology around things, because we actually have clinical trials that look at the response to what people are told about their genetics in comparison to what their actual genetics are. So, for example, there is an obesity gene called the FTO gene, which is involved in hunger, satiety, and obesity. And they've done studies where they've tested subjects to determine their genome, essentially, and to see if they have the good portion of this gene or the bad version of this gene. And then they've looked at things like hunger hormones and satiety hormones like ghrelin, GLP-1, and also like subjective metrics like self-reported fullness. And for most of the outcomes, regardless of what version of the genes they had, what mattered most was what they were told about their genes, both subjectively and objectively. So those who were told that they had a good version of the gene, regardless if they actually had the gene or not, reported greater feelings of fullness and had higher levels of GLP-1, and showed that their levels of satiety were both higher physiologically as well as psychologically, despite not even having that gene. So it's not only, we have to take into consideration, it's not only the genes, but it's also what you think about it. So if you have these self-limiting beliefs about your genes, and I've had guys that just think their genetics are shit. You know, they've been training 3 to 5 years. They read on these forums that within the first 3 to 5 years of natural training, you should be able to eke out 90% or whatever percentage someone wants to put on of their their natural muscular potential, but they haven't optimized everything. And it's this self-limiting mindset. When you kind of like extrapolate that out and pull them back from it and make them realize, listen, you've done a lot of things suboptimally. You haven't milked everything out like one of us have. You know, you have so much more genetic potential. Once they start, discarding those self-limiting beliefs, they're able to, kind of milk and really get every ounce of their potential out. And honestly, most of us aren't doing genetic testing, and the genetic testing we do have isn't, reliable enough where any of us know our genetics. So we really need to focus on what's in our control, which is our actions, our behaviors, and our habits, and trying to get the best physique that each and every one of us can, and not worrying about the genetic freaks that we see on the internet. And I think that's the biggest issue with social media, is that there's this comparison thing, and that's, comparison is the thief of joy, essentially.
Oh yeah, for sure. And one thing, I was actually thinking of making an Instagram post on this, but I don't, I'm hesitant to come across as somebody who's always trying to look at the negative side of it, but it's more just kind of like it's really what this is just a fact is, I've said many times before how we gravitate towards things that we're good at, right? So we see like if Doug Miller was on the opposite side of the genetic spectrum, you never would have heard of him, right? I mean, there's a reason that we hear about these guys. And something that I think people should realize is, if we assume that muscle mass potential follows a Gaussian curve like many human traits, right? Then, it's almost like a standard that people will say, okay, like your average natural bodybuilder, 5'9", 160 pounds on stage, right? That's kind of what we hear. That maybe like a Brad Loomis, even about Alberto Nunez, I think competes around 160, right? So let's say that's just like, and Alberto is actually better, but let's just say that 5'9", 160 is average. So then on the other extreme, we do very rarely see people who will compete at 5'9", 5'10", 185 natural, right? Even like Dice, and extremely impressive. If we see that and we acknowledge that they are still natural, then it is necessarily true that there's somebody out there who would then compete at 5'9", 135 pounds, right? If somebody is competing 25 pounds heavier than, let's say, a Brad Loomis, then again, if it follows this natural bell curve, then there is really somebody out there who would bust their ass for 20 years and step on stage at 5'9", 5'10", 140 pounds. Like that exists. You just don't see it because, frankly, nobody's going to do that for the most part because that they're going to look bad. They don't want to put in all that time into something that they're not good at. But that person does exist, and they could be doing just as good of a routine, just as good nutrition, and it could happen. So, this always goes back to like, following somebody who is knowledgeable. It can be hard to tell because when we say genetics reign supreme, that I would say genetics reign supreme over training and nutrition knowledge, over a lot of things, right? If you really have elite level genetics. So it's just to point out that those people do exist. Those are the people you'll never hear about. But I would say it's, again, almost necessarily true.
Yeah, it's we talked a lot before about what averages are and how would we rate our genetics. Like, are we just average, like you and I, Dave, let's say, or are we above average or below average? And like the longer I'm coaching people and the more people I work with, I think just a better picture I get of like, okay, like what is kind of out there among people who have been lifting for a couple of years. And for example, that strength standards video that I put out not long ago, and there I gave some standards of like, okay, if you hit this, that's pretty respectable. And a couple of years ago, I would have said that that's like laughably low. Like I said that if you can bench press, 80 kilos for most guys, that like kind of average-ish height, somewhere between say 5'9" and 6 foot, something like that. If you can bench press, 80 kilos for 5 reps, that's respectable. Like now we're talking, you're in the respectable zone at this point. I could bench press. I still would say that I don't have great genetics. I think I have okay genetics, but I could bench press that like probably midway through my first year of lifting or something like that. And I see tons of people that are not even close to that, and so I think we have a very skewed perception of what averages really are because we interact with a lot of people on Instagram and whatever. And so I got a general image of like, okay, like I would say that I have a roughly average physique because I see a lot of people who have been lifting for as long as I have, and most of them have similar levels of muscle mass. But man, like people on Instagram that are posting their pictures that are comfortable enough with their physique to actually post a picture, they're probably not truly average. Like in the grand scheme of things, they are probably already above average to some extent. So yeah, and that's why it's very hard for people to fathom that someone could be that impressive, partly. So
yeah, well, look at height, man. I mean, if there was like a height training gym, every basketball player would be a fake natty, and I mean, it's not the same because it's not you can't really change it for the most part. But I'm just saying when you look at how much humans vary in some other physical traits, I mean, it's amazing. So I think when it doesn't take if a 5 or sorry, not even like a 4'5" individual out there and a 7'3". I mean, you can imagine the genetic variation in muscle mass. So
Yeah, if someone never lived or someone was born in the Netherlands, or like Montenegro, let's say, like that's also a very tall country, and never left that country, like let's say a century ago or something, they would think that the average height for males is like, 6'1", and the average female height is like 5'7", 5'8", and then you go to like Asia or whatever, and like you see like, oh wow, like height really differs, across the globe.
So totally changing topics here, but one thing I wanted to talk about here is exercise selection and variation and things like that, because that's something that I do put emphasis on, but maybe not to the degree that some people, I've always kind of been a fan of like the tried and true exercises. And I just had Doug Brignoli on the podcast yesterday, and he's really big on the proper movements that are more efficient for, stimulation without a lot of fatigue. And I didn't agree with everything he said necessarily, but I understand his points. And actually, I think he has a lot of great points. So, I want to get your opinion on finding the right exercises for somebody versus just saying, okay, look, if you get really strong on squat, bench, deadlift, pull-ups, rows, whatever, like you're going to be pretty massive. I personally feel like if you do get really strong on those, you probably are going to be a large individual. I mean, some muscles are moving those weights, and those muscles are going to have to progress over time. But maybe there's something to be said from a bodybuilding standpoint of being able to, find this unique thing for you. I know John Meadows was big on that. Dante is big on that. Just finding specific, unique exercises.
No, I think starting with a foundation of some of the big compound lifts is the best option to go. And it's also the one that's going to give you the best foundation, especially from like a starting perspective. So when someone begins, I don't think it's necessary or even conducive to be getting sexy with exercises and with different, exercise selections and looking at different biomechanical, lever arms and things of that sort, and really going down the route of someone like a Kasim Hansen or someone that's a little bit more, advanced in terms of their methodologies. However, once you've gotten past those first few years and have put some muscle on your physique, as well as have gotten some base level strength, it doesn't mean you have to be a power lifter standard type of individual in terms of your bench, your squat, your overhead press, your deadlift. However, you have those solid foundations. That's where moving on to movements that fit your biomechanics, fit your leverages a little bit better is going to be more conducive, especially if hypertrophy is your goal. We also have to take it back to the point, are we speaking about hypertrophy? Are we speaking about strength? Are we speaking about fitness? It's really goal dependent. And that's where I find when I have someone first come to me, a client, and they're just a newbie starting out, I am starting with more that big three type of fundamental lifts, getting them prioritizing progressive overload. Just like Dante used to say all the time, and I remember back in the forums, that you're never going to see someone that's benching 405 that doesn't have a big chest. Now, do I agree with that 100%? No, because there are plenty of guys that are disproportionately strong and don't have a high level of muscle mass. But generally, if we look at averages, someone benching 315 or 405 and doing it for reps is going to have a big chest. They're going to be muscularly developed. However, past the point of your first few years of training is where I think we really get into more exercise selection and really sequencing things. And even if we look at some of the research on exercise selection, it has been shown that I believe it was a study in 2014 by Fonseca and colleagues. I don't know if you guys are familiar with this study, where they looked at either doing one exercise, which was a Smith machine squat, compared to 4 exercises for the legs. And I believe it was a hack squat, a deadlift variation, so an RDL, a leg press, and a leg curl. And they saw better hypertrophy gains in the group that did more of a varied exercise selection, because you're able to activate the distal and proximal parts of those muscle groups, and there's variety in there. And also, I think from just like a psychological perspective, that's something I'm always bringing back with clients. What is going to fit your psychology? In the beginning, sticking with these bare bones basic lifts, this is a novel stimulus to those individuals. They really need to ingrain those motor patterns and get those neural gains just through the process of doing these things repetitively. However, past that level, that intermediate level of advancement, that's where, increasing exercise selection, you've been in the gym more times, so you're going to be more susceptible to wanting to change things up. And it's not just about the physiological response that your body has to training, it's also the psychological response. So we have to take into consideration, is this person been doing the same list for years on end, and it's leading to a lack of motivation? If they're not finding that they're able to push themselves because they don't even want to go in the gym because they've been doing these same, bare bones basic lifts, that's where exercise variation needs to come into consideration.
Yeah. So I just got myself familiar with Doug Brignoli's work, although I think the official pronunciation is Doug Brignol or Brignol or something.
Brignol, yeah.
Yeah, but so I'm honestly very intrigued by his work, and I think he has a very good understanding of biomechanics, and said a few things which like totally made sense. And I think so. I agree with his fundamental premise, at least on a theoretical level. So an exercise can be less efficient than another one because if you need to make up with more load or with more volume with a given exercise for the fact that it's not actually hitting the muscle in a way in which it was intended to be hit. So in the case of the pecs, like ideally it would do this, like, what is it? Horizontal abduction, I believe. Adduction, sorry, yeah. So like, yeah, with a barbell bench press, like you're attempting to do that in a way, but at the same time, it's like not really the ideal kind of motion for the pecs. So I can get on board with that. I think for one, I'm not sure how much that actually matters. Because I mean, for example, if I'm thinking of a sissy squat, which is his favorite thing, versus just a barbell squat, and let's say you're able to do that in a way that Mike Israetel is doing it. So like calves are touching the hamstrings like super deep. I mean, at the end of the day, you're still going through the same motion with your knees, like you're extending them. And it's pretty easy to see that like that's still kind of the limiting factor, because when you get tired or when you go to failure, like you're no longer going to be able to extend the knees. So like, does it matter that the resistance is not coming directly from here, but that is kind of like more indirectly? So for one, I'm not sure if that matters. And I think the bigger concern is that, yes, those exercises might be better on a movement for movement or load for load. They might be better, but I think they have a very high like wheel spinning potential, I guess. So I think just the fact that you're able to measure your progression with those maybe less efficient movements is just such a big plus for them that it can actually like really keep someone on track. And I think that can be especially useful for those that are maybe not as genetically gifted. They have a harder time gaining muscle, and just having a metric that they can track can just ensure that they are heading in the right direction. Because, I mean, we've all seen it. People that are really caught up with mind-muscle connection and how certain things feel, those things have a place, but generally, like that tends to be a pretty surefire way of just messing around and not really getting anywhere. So like that would be my only problem. Like, I could see like, okay, I could have my clients doing that, like lat pull in that Doug likes a lot instead of chin-ups and pull-ups. But how are you going to measure your progression with that lat pull in once you're like fairly strong on it and the cable stack is jumping up with like 10-pound increments? So I think these practical considerations just kind of make it a non-viable approach in my opinion. And we're still better off going with not the big three, but like, compound movements that we can actually track progress on. So.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that he and I agreed with is that, he said like, like a shrug is maybe good for the traps, or a curl is probably just fine for biceps. Basically, when it comes to isolation, like single joint exercises, I think he's pretty on, like on the same page as everybody else, because how many variations of like a calf raise can you do, and it's not to say there's no variations and no differences, but I think his big issue is some of these like big compound movements, like a barbell bench press, how you're really not getting that adduction, right? So I think when you actually look at like, and again, I understand that this is maybe not scientific, but when you look at how so many people have gotten big. And, right before recording, I said, do I really believe that Ronnie Coleman would have built those legs if he had just done sissy squats and leg extensions? Like, I don't. I would never take that bet that he would have gotten to that same level of development. Is it possible? Sure. Obviously, we don't know. It's just very hard for me to believe. And even this is something I would actually ask Steve Hall, but I know like Steve doesn't do any overhead pressing, and Doug Brignoli's not big on overhead pressing at all. But I think like just when I think of the progression with like a lateral raise, I mean, I know massive guys who are doing lateral raises with like 30 pounds. They're still using the same weights that like they were doing forever ago. It's not an exercise that I typically see people like really focusing on progressive overload. You're still pushing, but almost anybody can make a 30 or 40 pound lateral raise very hard. So versus like if you do like an overhead press, you can progress from 50 pounds for 10 reps to 180 pounds for 10 reps. Like no question that person's shoulders are going to be monstrous. Whereas like with laterals and things like that, I just don't see that clear correlation as much.
Yeah, the overhead press is a good example of that, where that one I'm actually like a little bit on the fence about. So I do like to program it just because it's just such a good hard hitter for multiple muscle groups. But if I'm just looking at the function of the side delts, really, okay, I cannot show it like right now, but basically you're doing this with your upper arm, and you're not really doing that with the overhead press. Like if you're just looking at the upper arm, it does this. And if you're looking at what is actually facing the resistance the most, it's kind of more so your front delts. So I could see someone making a point against that. And I actually used to be kind of anti-overhead pressing for that reason for a while. But I think that's the other thing with this whole optimizing exercise selection thing, is that there's a time efficiency cost that might still favor compound movements, even though they might be less load efficient, as Doug would call it. So yeah, let's say a barbell back squat. Let's say you're like not optimally built for them. You're not a Mike Israetel. You can still go to parallel, at least, maybe even slightly below, but you could make an argument that a CC squat would be better for your quads, and then like some sort of a kickback movement would be better for your glutes. But still you're hitting the quads and the glutes in the same movement, and you're hitting at least isometrically the erectors. Even your calves are getting a little bit of stimulation. So, and that all of that you're getting in one set. So would you do that, or you would do 3 sets of CC squats and then glute kickbacks and calf raises? Maybe let's take the calf raises out because those are not going to be super well hit. But, like that's kind of the benefit of compound movements. And the same thing with an overhead press or with a bench press. So that's kind of another issue. I don't know how he's programming or like how he sets up volume and those things. And
his volume is pretty high. He'll talk about how for like a given exercise, he'll do 30 reps, 20 reps, 15 reps with increasing effort. So not like the failure. And then he'll do, I think he said for abs was his example, he'll then do 10, 10, 10, 10. So, he's doing like 7 or 8 sets per exercise, just for the one body part. So I imagine we agreed that a longer rest period has been shown to be more effective in studies. And so I don't know how long his workouts are, but I would imagine quite long if he's really resting 3 to 5 minutes between sets.
Yeah. And also, some of these compound movements are actually, like, for example, the triceps are a good example, or the quads as well, or maybe I should just say the elbows and the knees. He's always talking about like these load efficient exercises are worse because you have to load up that squat eventually with 400 pounds, whereas like you could keep doing CC squats with just body weight. Like the knees are one joint that get pretty easily screwed up for a lot of people with like really deep knee flexion. Like the CC squat is a pretty notoriously knee killer movement. And I think there could be a case to be made for a squat, even with 400 pounds, could be actually safer for the joints than, body weight CC squats. Like I just tried, I sent you the video, these leg press CC squats, basically. So I was like doing them on my toes, and I could go into that really deep knee flexion. I can use really, really light weights, and that's actually really nice. But I would not be surprised if like 2 weeks from now, if I keep doing it, even with like, 30 kilos, my knees would start screaming at me. Whereas like with a squat or with a leg press, I won't be able to go as deep, but I can keep doing them and it doesn't hurt my knees. And same thing with a tricep extension, like, with an overhead press, like you might be able to do it for a long time, or with a bench press, or even with a close grip bench press. Whereas if you do like overhead tricep extensions, like for me, I can just do it like this without any weight. If I did 100 reps of this, tomorrow my elbows would hurt.
Really?
So,
wow.
Yeah.
I'm not too familiar with Doug's stuff, but what is his opinion, say, on something like the triceps, since we're speaking on that? What movements does he find to be most efficient, and what is his methodology of programming? Is he really looking at the function of the muscle and then trying to target that, or just looking for efficiency? Because if we're talking about the triceps, the first function would be to extend the elbow and then to extend the shoulder. So how is he, targeting that?
So we definitely got into
triceps.
Yeah, well, I asked about, because Abel, you wanted me to ask about like the stretch issue, and so because he is not a fan of like an overhead dumbbell extension, which I actually am, and it does not cause me elbow pain. It's actually a pretty good exercise for me. But he said he's not a fan of that, and we were talking about the getting it into the long head into a maximally stretched position, and he said that he does not believe that a maximally stretched position is important for hypertrophy. And then one of the points Abel brought up is that, so then why is he a fan of like a seated leg curl over, like, say, a prone leg curl? And there was a recent study showing that the seated leg curl had more hypertrophy than the prone. But his argument there was, when you're prone, if you have your leg too far back, you get into passive insufficiency. And that probably, if people want to hear more about that, you can just watch the podcast I did with him. But regarding triceps, he feels that as long as you basically work it through a sufficient range of motion, and that you don't need to have like a full stretch. So he was a fan, and I didn't get into too much with specific exercises, but I feel like he was a fan of like some presses, but he's all about the angle that the muscle fiber is actually ideally working. So one example he gave was, instead of, let's say you're doing a tricep push down, if the weight is in front of me, the cable is in front of me, I should say, and you're pushing down like this, he says it's a good exercise, but not as good as if you turn around and then the angle, or the force is directed exactly against how the tricep would be working. So, I mean, it's a little hard for me to demonstrate on here. So if you're like facing away, that the force is directed exactly how the tricep would function. And I think actually, Abel, you sent me one by, was it Kasim? Somebody who had a whole long post about, the proper way to work the tricep based on where the force is directed. Again, it's one of those things where I think it has face validity. Like, I get what you're saying. I just question, does it actually matter? Because there are a million arguments in medicine and exercise science where things have face validity, and then it doesn't actually pan out that way. It's like, well, hey, based on this and that, it totally makes sense this would happen. And I mean, I could spend a half an hour talking about how many examples like that don't end up actually working out in practice. So that's where I get I question it a little bit.
Interesting. No, I'm definitely looking forward to checking out his content as well as your podcast with him, because I could see if he was saying from like an injury perspective to stay out of the fully lengthened position, because we see that most people will either get injured in the fully lengthened or fully shortened position, because we're strongest in the mid range of any motion. But then to essentially say not to hit certain exercises or to avoid certain exercises that go into that strength or that fully lengthened position, I think that you're discarding, first of all, some of the functions of the muscle, also full range of motion training, and then other, we've seen that varying joint angles, with exercises increases muscle activation. So it's like, it kind of sounds, and this is just my interpretation based off what you guys are saying, that he's very selective with a few key exercises that he sticks to and he promotes, and then the rest are kind of discarded. And that could be a misinterpretation on my end, but I always get weary when I hear people that they promote just certain, whether it be ideologies in training or nutrition, exercises, or macronutrient groups or distributions, and they kind of disregard everything else, because we have to realize there's many paths that lead to Rome. So it's like we could all do a completely different program. And especially when it comes to hypertrophy, it's a really forgiving stimulus. It's like we can all do completely different types of training modalities, different rep ranges, and we see that the hypertrophy outcomes are very similar. So sometimes I think people get caught up in this minutia, which is why I was hitting on previously. For a beginner, I'm sticking with those main compound lifts, and then I'm splicing up and I'm incorporating more variety and a little bit more attention to detail with exercise selection. But I really am looking for varying joint angles. I'm trying to put a lot of motion or a lot of movements in a full range of motion. And if I'm not, I'm using something like, a cable kickback to get my tricep in a fully shortened position, a tricep push down to keep my shoulder at 0 degrees of flexion. And then like you had said, like a tricep overhead to get my tricep fully stretched and then fully lengthened.
Yeah, and I don't want to mischaracterize him, especially if, obviously he's not here to defend the arguments that I might not even be making them perfectly. But I would say he definitely does factor in the injury aspect. That is a big part of it, is just to say that, you see some of these people who are broken down over the years. And I do agree with that. I mean, I just saw there was a podcast with Fuad and this guy, I guess Guy Cisterno. I just saw it on somebody else's story, and they were saying, like, would you give up? And then Doug mentioned another, I think with Rick Drassen, who they were basically talking to these guys and now they're in their 40s plus. And he said, would you give up this championship, or would you give up, the fact that you were benching 400 plus pounds and the memories of all of that to then feel good now? And they were like, of course I would do that. Like, of course. And I think somebody like Ronnie is an exception, where he's like, oh, I don't have any regrets, because he's a freaking 8-time Mr. Olympia, right? I mean, everything he has in his life is pretty much owed to his success that he had. But I think the example that actually Abel, this kind of demotivated me for my pull-up goal, because his example was like, let's say you did 100 pull-ups and you had this goal to do 100 pull-ups. Well, like, that's not even close to the record. So it's like you maybe have like caused, tendinitis and all these problems. And actually, I think pull-ups are a relatively good and safe exercise, but this is just this example. And it was like, you're at the end of the day, you get this, but like, what did you do that for if it's just going to cause you problems? Now, I definitely would back up a little bit and say, look, I don't think everything we need to do in life needs to be to like prove something to somebody else or win a record. Like, there's things that you can do for your own, self progress. So I don't want to take it to the extreme, but this is why I would have a hard time doing something outside of just my ego, where it's like, look, what does it get me to do this? And is it going to cause long-term problems? And that's where I said, like, look, okay, does like, for instance, I stopped deadlifting really heavy. And part of me is like, oh, I love deadlifting. I was really good at it relatively, but is it worth it for me to break my back to go from 500 to 560? Like, if I get to a 560, I'm still not that impressive, like on the internet. I'm still like, it doesn't do anything for me. It's like, okay, you went from like, mediocre to like a little above mediocre. Like, it's cool. And again, there's a lot to be said for like self-progress, but not at the expense of years and years of like pain down the road. Lane Norton's another example. He literally held a world record in the squat. So a lot of people hate on him because of him breaking himself. Maybe he hasn't done everything he the right way. But if you're going for a world record, I can justify a little bit more than like, you set a PR in your garage and now you're broken. So it's a little rant.
Yeah. I mean, it's, we talked about this privately a few times, but you emphasize that you don't want to take it to the extreme, so I'm not addressing this to you, but I always have a general issue when people say that, like, why would you do X, whether that's a certain exercise or whatever, getting contest lean for no good reason because you're not competing, because like, why would you do any of that if you're then not going to do X, or if you're not going to get X out of it? And it's like why do you assume that those are the things that I actually value? So like, I never competed myself, and I don't think I ever will, but I can totally see myself getting down to, say, 5% body fat at one point or something like that. That's just a personal challenge. And probably it's not going to treat my relationship, my marriage, probably not going to treat it right. It's probably not going to treat my mental health right, or my whatever proclivity for eating disorders, any of those things. But I like the challenge. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, like, whether something is a good exercise, that's like whether that would hit the muscle better, that's kind of a different question than, is it going to potentially cause joint issues? So, I mean, I do think that like full flexion of the elbow is probably optimal for triceps development. Anytime I try to do that, I get elbow pain. So, but, like that doesn't mean that I don't think that would be the optimal way to train the triceps. So when a client sends me a form video of a tricep extension, which doesn't happen that often because it's not a super technical exercise, right. But if they don't go for that full tricep extension, I will say, like, if your elbows tolerate it, I would recommend you to go into that full flexion. But so those are kind of two different things, and also like it's kind of like certain things are just not worth taking the risk for. Like, for example, I just had this big argument with someone that on a Romanian deadlift, like I do think that like a lot of people just go too deep in that there's no more range of motion in the hamstrings and the glutes. And basically all the remaining range of motion just comes from the lower back. And it's like, well, why is that a bad thing? It's like, well, if I don't think it's a good idea to do dynamic contractions with your erector spinae with like, 150, 200 kilos. Like if you want to do that, then do it Doug Brignoli style with very lightweight, just like hunching over and straightening up, or on the back extension machine or something like that. So like, in some cases, it's just not worth taking the extra risk because like there are just better options that are safer.
So Brandon, I actually don't know how you is your setup. I mean, is it pretty standard? Like I actually don't ask that many people because I don't think that the specific split matters all that much, but I am curious. I mean, you've been training for a very long time. Did some of these like principles resonate with you? Do you kind of stick with the bread and butter?
Yeah, so I'm gonna put a caveat out there. I just got cleared yesterday post surgery, so my training as of the last 2.5 months has been completely different. I've done a lot of blood flow restriction because I haven't been able to load the tissues. I've been in a car accident, so I had a procedure done. But previous to that, I have tried every different methodology that you could think of. I have trained, done Mountain Dog training programs. I've had Eugene Teo program my training. I've done some of Cassim Hansen's work and worked with Alan Kress. So I've tried a multitude of different training ideologies and approaches throughout the years. I do tend to, I don't prioritize a lot of the big 3 compound lifts anymore, just due to injuries that I've had in the past. I have had a reconstructive knee surgery, so I don't do back squats. I would favor a hack squat or a Smith machine squat as my primary compound movement for that movement profile. In terms of, I used to be a big bench presser in terms of just my love for the movement itself, big into the incline press. I do not do either of those two because I have had a pec tear. So these are limitations that I have. Incline pressing. Years ago during college. So I've had some experiences that have taught me to do things in a different manner. I do like how Mountain Dog went about, RIP to him, how he went about his programming in terms of just the setup of exercise selection, in terms of not doing your compounds first, doing some type of pre-activation type movement to get blood into the tissue, as well as to get a greater stimulus, and not just focus just on the big compound lift. So if I am going to hit a bench press, it's going to be after, say, an incline press where I've really activated all the pectoral fibers. And I tend now to do more higher frequency, full body training, or I'll do like a half body split, where I'm training things 2 to 3 times per week, in comparison to when my max was 2 times per week previously. But I've went up into even 5-6 times a week in terms of training frequency. And the reason that I've kind of gravitated towards that is that I've realized that as I've gotten more advanced as a trainee, the volume that is an effective stimulus for me, it's not a huge amount of volume, but it's higher than it was previously. So I get better, more effective volume by spreading them out into a higher frequency type setup throughout the week than I do when I utilize a lower frequency setup and have to do more volume per session per muscle group.
Yeah. Gotcha. Okay. Yeah. It does seem like most people, and I'm still holding on to the love for some of like the main movements, but I suspect that I will not in coming years, but I still try to do like pretty heavy overhead press, pull-ups, bench. I've been recently getting back into like deadlifts, but as I mentioned, I think in our group chat earlier, like I'm doing the RDLs, and I just have this like low back injury that every time I do a deadlift over like 225, it just reactivates it. And like I'm going like slow, controlled, muscularly. It's a joke. It's like I've even not deadlifting forever. It's super easy, but like I don't know. I just wake up the next day and like I can't move. So I'm like, I just
That's why I tell you. Now, let me ask you: with this approach that you've taken, have you had injuries or surgeries in the past from training or non-training related issues? Because that's where it really changed my ideology. Was getting injuries and having multiple surgeries. So at this point, I'm 3 surgeries in.
Wow.
I've learned my lesson. It's not that I demonize these lifts. These were due to, multiple factors. Generally, when I tore my pec, I hadn't slept at night. I had pulled an all-nighter during college. So I was already in a fatigue condition. I was lifting a very heavy amount of weight relative to what I normally would do. I was going for not a max lift, but I was going for a max within a rep range.
Yeah.
So I was trying to progress despite the fact that my body was telling me, listen, you're exhausted. You probably should ease off. So, that's where over the years, I used to be someone that it would take me 12 to 16 weeks to deload. Now I do more of a 4 to 6 to 1 paradigm. So, sometimes I'll deload after 4 weeks and sometimes I'll be able to stretch it out to 6. So it's very different, but it's also come from your experience changes and shapes your perception as well as your approach. So when I have people come to me and they've been injured, I have an IFBB pro who's had multiple shoulder surgeries, and I have him do very minimal shoulder work because it doesn't make sense. He already has great developed and capped delts. So to push that, to do an overhead press, to do something that would be potentially injurious to him, it's just not worth it for the cost to benefit ratio.
Is that so? I'm curious. What are some of the lists? Like I'm guessing this incline bench. How much were you using at the time? Do you remember?
I toured on the 7th rep of 285.
Okay, so I mean, you're a pretty strong guy. I don't know. And then you said you had a knee reconstruction.
Yeah, I tore my ACL, my LCL, my MCL, and my medial and lateral sides of my meniscus.
In one injury, or what was that?
So I had previous tears that were unaddressed. I had the meniscus tear, but it was something that a surgeon had said that wasn't necessary to get operated on at the time. And I tore it after a squatting session.
Gotcha. Yeah. Yeah. It's just like a matter of time. I know, because I haven't like had any surgeries and I haven't had any like severe injuries, but I've had enough like, okay, the pec is, I was doing incline bench with not that much, but I my best was 265 for 5, I want to say. And I just remember like the outer edge of my pec, like every rep, I was like, "Ooh, that's not good." Kept going. That's really not good. And like my ego, and then the deadlifts too. And I just, if you look at like how Abel trains, how Steve Hall trains, like it's clearly at least as good for muscle growth, in my opinion. And looking at these guys. And there's just no question that the longevity is much better with it. So it really is a matter of time, I think, for most people. Some people would disagree, but
yeah,
I think we have to realize that there's a difference between an external workload and then an internal stimulus. So I tend to favor more towards, I've seen how Abel trains, some of the footage that he's put out. He's really looking for muscle activation and stuff. And it's not that he's avoiding compound movements, but someone like him, Steve Hall, even a Mike Israel, guys like that, Kasim, he gets very nuanced into movement selection. However, I think that for me personally, just based off my experiences and my previous injuries and some of the limitations that I have, it's a little bit more favorable of an approach. But there are people that get great stimulus. We look at someone like a Dusty Hanshaw that's 20-something years into the game and still, deadlifts off the floor, big barbell row type of guy. So it's like, it's all fit for the individual, and you have to take into consideration your leverages, your biomechanics, your previous injury, your susceptibility to injury. And that's where I really, discuss with clients, listen, what is your previous history like? I really need to know that before we can, I don't need to know just what you were doing the previous 12 weeks. I need to know what you've been doing if you've been training 10 years. Mm-hmm. What injuries have you had in or out of the gym? How susceptible are you to injury? What niggles do you have? A lot of times, I've learned through my own experience, through ignorance, honestly, is that I've pushed past the point of where I should be going because of the ego, because of my attachment to training, because we embrace, especially where all 3 of us came from, where it was just go hard or go home, and it was do more, and it was a lot of the things that were being preached aren't what they are now. So I think that has really shaped my experience. And going forward, it is an approach that has allowed me, or is going to allow me, to have more longevity in this.
Yep. What were you going to say, Abel?
I just wanted to say that I heard Eric Helms say on a podcast, and I heard it in like 2017, but it just kind of stuck with me, that he tends to see kind of a pattern with how people approach lifting technique and prehabilitation, or kind of just injury prevention in their training. And usually it starts out with someone getting into lifting in their, when they're 20 or late teens, something like that. And in the beginning, of course, they are reckless, they're indestructible, and they're just like doing things very haphazardly as far as like lifting technique and everything. And then they will get their first relatively major injury, and it just scares the shit out of them. Mm-hmm. And then after that, they will have a couple of years when they're like very smart and really conservative. And then the next stage is like, oh shit, now I'm 30. Now I should really kind of settle the hell down and do things in the smart way. And then they're kind of just like, as Lyle McDonald says, like they're just fighting the purgatory of aging, or whatever his phrase is, which is of course stupid after just 30. I don't think he said that either, but like it's definitely been the case for me as well. Like I had that shoulder injury that I talked about a few times in 2015. And that was in the middle of a training phase where I was making some really solid gains and some really good progress. I was hitting PRs week in, week out. That's when I was coached by Menno, actually. And high volume training, like I could hit my chest every day. I loved it. Well, not every day, but, high frequency training. And I just did a movement pattern, like an overhead press with a relatively narrow grip, and my rotator cuff is just not it. I mean, it basically, you have to be pretty flexible to get the bar overhead like that. And I just like tore my I think supraspinatus that it was, and like mildly subluxed my shoulder, and it basically took me off the gym for over a year. As well, like I couldn't train my upper body properly. Wow. And it was like just such a psychologically like really difficult time for me to deal with, because at that time I was more enthusiastic about lifting than ever. And I was like watching YouTube videos and listening to podcasts about lifting all the time. And I still had the habit of doing that, and like listening to all these guys and hearing about their progress and everything, and me not being able to do it in the meantime. It was like really, really hard. So since then, I've been just a lot more conservative, and in a way, it kind of served me well, if you will, that I had that injury like early on, so that like I don't have to learn this lesson, like let's say now, because I already had this mindset for a while.
You guys have both mentioned at times like switching to exercises that are maybe safer for you. Brandon, I didn't realize did you work with Kasim, or he just helped you program?
No, I work directly with Alan Kress. Alan Kress has been one of my mentors since 2015, and Alan does some of the educational stuff with Kasim himself. He does a lot of the muscle camps. Also, I've went to seminars with Ben Picolsi, with Jordan Shallow, with Eugene Teo. I've done seminars with Joe Bennett, the hypertrophy coach. So I've been all over the country, studying different methodologies of hypertrophy training, exercise selection, and things of that sort, and incorporating things. I've done specialized programs from them that were specifically made for me. And then I've also taken something like more of I don't want to say a cookie cutter approach, but a program like John Meadows that you could just easily purchase.
So I know with this coming, I think maybe, or is it this season or next season, Alberto is going to compete. And he said he really feels like he's made some progress with Kasim, like working close with him. So we'll see, if that materializes anything. But did you actually find, because I think certainly I believe that you can maintain a lot of the size and see similar results by, some of these machines and different exercises, and you don't have to go so heavy, like I said before, like for me, it's in part still an ego thing. But did you actually find that any exercises that maybe Kasim or the other guy helped you with, do you think they provided additional benefit? Like you actually saw a muscle develop more by incorporating those, or was it more just that you were able to not be as injurious?
I think the injury prevention was one of the most primary benefits of that approach. Also, just from a mindset perspective and maybe just an educational perspective, I really like a lot of the stuff that I learned during my time working with them. just in terms of how to approach periodization, because we don't have a lot of literature on periodization in the context of hypertrophy, because it really does come from a strength background. So they periodize things in a very different fashion, where they're doing blocks, systemic blocks, essentially. So you have hypertrophy blocks, you have neurological phase blocks, you have sarcoplasmic blocks, so higher volume blocks. So it was just kind of separating out the different approaches to different I guess, eliciting different stimuli. So that was pretty interesting. I will say I don't train in that fashion anymore. And so really the person that I've probably benefited the most from, one other person I do want to give a shout out to, is Scott Stevenson, Dr. Scott Stevenson. I've learned an incredible amount from him doing consultations as well as reading his book. And I like his approach much better, which is taking and utilizing many methodologies within your training. I find that to be both physiologically beneficial, but also psychologically beneficial. So the one thing, I did like what I learned from Cassim and from Alan, but it was very specific. So there were blocks of training that was more of a Gironda 8x8 type style with 30 to 40 seconds rest in between sets. And that would be like a block. You would do that for 4 to 6 weeks to really increase mitochondrial density. You would really look for sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, so more of that, the opposite of a myofibrillar. And so I just didn't find, for me, psychologically, I didn't really get into that because I got a little bit burnt out on one stimuli, whereas having multiple types of rep ranges, utilizing something more of like, I utilize daily undulating periodization. So varying rep ranges between muscle groups throughout the course of a week, I find that to be the most beneficial for my personal, training, as well as for a lot of my clients.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment because everybody who's watched this podcast at least a few times has probably heard me talk about Scott Stevenson. I'm a big fan of him personally. I've known him for, 4 or 5 years now. But just also like he's really one of the only people in this space who, and this has happened more since like the podcast, but prior to the podcast, I honestly never really spoke to that many people who were much more knowledgeable than I am. Obviously they exist. I'm not trying to say I'm like the smartest guy, but I'm just, in person, I never meet those people. Right. And then even like on the forums, it's a lot of bros. Like I just didn't really come across it too much. And Scott was somebody who I was consistently humbled by, where it's like, okay, I'd make what I thought was a fairly good point. And then he'd show me like 10 studies and then have this variation and everything. I'd be like, geez, man, like his book, he's got Fortitude Training, and then he's got Be Your Own Bodybuilding Coach. And I definitely recommend them. He's, like I said, great guy, but super knowledgeable. And I don't know if you've actually done his Fortitude Training or if you're just taking principles. But
I've done full cycles. I did a full year of Fortitude Training, and I also consulted him on a lot of the questions that I had regarding it. What was great was, I'm fairly certain he still has this, but he had an open forum that if you bought the Fortitude Training book, you could ask any questions. You could DM on Instagram. He's super responsive. I've done a couple podcasts with him myself. And Scott's great because it's not only about his ideologies or his approaches. What he really tries to get people to do is be a critical thinker. So there were things that he promoted within his book that was, remember, when you're putting out a program to the masses, you have to go with an average program, what would fit the average individual. And there's so much customization within that, because training and just all of this, fitness in general, is an N of one experiment. So it was really good. I was able to go back and forth with him between, different philosophies and trying different approaches that were within the book, but taking a different take on them. So muscle rounds, there were certain derivations that I used that were a little bit different than what he prescribed in the book himself. So he does a 6x4 type of muscle round. There were times within my training that I went to a 4x4. There was times I went to an 8x4. So, we utilize different things, and I would just bounce off ideas. And Scott's great in the fact that he's not someone that's dogmatic in any of his beliefs. So he's encouraging you to think outside the box. And that's how he came to a lot of his own approaches himself. But then he also reinforces them with research. So like you were saying, he would send you all these studies. I've gotten down the rabbit hole with Scott multiple times where I've had a belief on something that I've read in the literature on, certain philosophies, whether it be nutritionally, supplementation wise, different topics. And he's sent me 15 other studies that either disproves it or kind of just changes my interpretation of it. And I need that open-mindedness because, like you said, sometimes you're in your own echo chamber and you might be the smartest or most intelligent person on a topic within your circle of friends. And then when you have someone that's on a different level and just doesn't try to put you down, but tries to challenge your intellect and your ability to be a critical thinker, that's where you elevate yourself to the next level.
Yeah, I believe he was a professor for a while, I think at Phoenix. But yeah, his approach and his ability to make you think is really not something that I see a lot in the industry or just in general. I mean, he's got a good following, but I really feel like his following should be like 10 times what it is.
I personally think he's probably the most intelligent person within the space of hypertrophy.
Yeah. If not the most, he's certainly up there. Abel, have you had direct contact with him? I think you've had him. Have you had him on your podcast?
I had him on a few times.
You did?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
2 times. Sorry. Yeah.
Okay.
It's just a few. Seems like a few times because each of them were like 3 hours.
Right. Yeah. It's definitely always a long one. All right, guys. Well, thank you as always for taking the time. Always good when we can get everybody together and collaborate like this. I think everybody is fairly familiar with you guys at this point, but where can everybody find more of your stuff?
Okay, I'll start. SSD Abel on YouTube and ssdable.com on just the internet in general, and SSD Abel on Instagram. How cool.
You guys can find me best at or on Instagram at Brandon DaCruz _ and then also bdacruzfitness@gmail.com if you guys have any questions.
Cool. Thanks again, guys.
Thank you.